Hello, listeners. I'm Sam with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host Am Johal is joined by Srećko Horvat, a philosopher, author, and co-founder of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. Am and Srećko discuss the journey behind launching the Island School of Social Autonomy on the Adriatic island of Vis in Croatia. ISSA is a place for imagining, experimenting with, and cultivating forms of knowledge production and knowledge sharing for the age of extinction. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted you could join us again. This week we have a special guest. Srećko Horvat is with us. Welcome, Srećko.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here and to talk to you today.
Why don't we start with you introducing yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so my name is Srećko, which means in my language it would mean the lucky one. By education, I'm a philosopher and linguist, but besides just writing and publishing, I've been also, let's call it an activist, or better to say an organizer for the last 2 decades of various social movements, but also various cultural events in the Balkans, across Europe. Well, besides my work here on the School of Social Autonomy on an island in the Adriatic Sea, I'm also very active in internationalist struggles across the world.
I'm wondering, maybe we can start with this new project, this new experiment, the Island School of Social Autonomy. And I got in touch with you after hearing about it. I've had a number of entanglements with various free schools and educational interventions outside of the university, although I'm located inside one now. But wondering if you could just give a little context for some of our audience who might not have heard about it or know about kind of where the project came from and some of the ideas behind it. I know it's located on Vis.
Yeah, so maybe best is to start from the location itself, from geography. So it's located in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, which is part, of course, of the Mediterranean. So somewhere in between Italy and Croatia on an island, which is called Vis, which 2,500 years ago was called ISSA. It was the first polis founded by the ancient Greeks in this part of the Adriatic Sea. Funnily, it was founded by Dionysius of Syracuse, the same guy who imprisoned Plato on Syracuse. So there is a theory also that Plato might have been there or not, who knows. But in any case, it's been a polis, then it was an autonomous polis. It's a very interesting place, which is also one of the reasons why we took the name ISSA as the acronym for the Island School of Social Autonomy 2,500 years later. Basically, we started from buying 3 hectares of land, 30,000 square meters, and a very old stone house, which in the last year we succeeded to reconstruct, build a roof, a gallery, turning it slowly into an island library, into the headquarters of the school. So now, of course, the question is, what's the school and why a school in the 21st century? Why not another conference, another workshop, another seminar, a university or whatever? You said it already, we are placed outside of the academy, although we have many people on board who are academics or who have studied or who are still teaching at various universities in the world. But the idea was that we try to critically examine what's wrong with higher education today, with universities, but at the same time, modestly to try to create a different model of education. And when I say a different model, then of course this model, I think, cannot be just constrained by classical education in the sense of, the typical classroom, usually with neon lights, with a very structured program, very structured syllabus, and so on. What we are doing is actually creating a classroom, turning the island itself into an open-air classroom. This summer already we had various activities across the island, from lectures by, for instance, Franco Berardi Bifo, leading Italian philosopher who was part of the autonomist movement in the 70s, who founded the legendary pirate radio station Radio Alice. Then together with our dear friends and co-founders of the school, Mediengruppe Beatnik, who are artists from Germany and Switzerland and the Balkans. We also experimented already this summer with our own pirate radio station. The idea is that we combine modern technology with traditional technologies, all in the setting context of an Adriatic island, but also in the context of extinction, namely in the context of a deep crisis, not only of education, but a deep crisis of meaning, deep crisis of climate, deep crisis of social, economic, and political relations and geopolitical relations today. We think, we are convinced, and that's the reason why we started this project, that we need to offer not only a new analysis, but also some very concrete proposals in which way we could actually not just cope with the situation, with the catastrophe today, but in which way we can actually go beyond it. And in that sense, we are, of course, influenced by a vast tradition of critical pedagogy, various models of education, schooling, or rather deschooling. For instance, one of inspirations of ISSA, of our school, is, of course, Ivan Illich, whose origin is actually from another island called Brač, which we can see from the school, from the island of Vis. But then later he ended up in Vienna, and then, of course, in the United States, and then later in Mexico, where he launched his famous school in Cuernavaca, which was then visited by Paulo Freire, by many others who are today considered as, the teachers of, if we can call them like that, of critical pedagogy. I'm saying if we can call them by that, because of course what critical pedagogy did and what we are aiming to do is also to deconstruct this very relationship between the teacher and the pupil, between someone who has the authority, or if you want, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the subject supposed to know, and on the other hand, well, all of us who in various parts of our forms of our lives are teachers. But in this situation, I think we are all students who are together learning something about not just mere survival in times of extinction, but also good life in times of extinction. So that's a very short introduction, but we can, of course, go deeper into it.
Yeah. And I was going to say, you talked about the long history of Vis, but also I went there many years ago just for a few days. Of course, has a very interesting history during the Yugoslav era with Tito, and wondering if you could just sort of speak to its more near history and why you spoke a little bit to the why of the school, but in terms of building out the project, it's clearly a labor of love. And it takes a lot to build something new, and wondering if you could speak just a little bit to sort of those histories and entanglements of, why this type of school now.
Mm-hmm. Well, the history itself is also a good response, although we are not nostalgic towards the history. We are also trying to critically examine it, but we are, of course, inspired by emancipatory histories, not just of our part of the world, but across the planet, in various times, in various geographies. But more specifically, the island of Vis was, as you said, in the 20th century, a crucial place for the liberation of Europe, not just what would become socialist Yugoslavia, but of Europe from the fascists and from the Nazis. So at that time, that was summer 1944, most of Europe was still occupied by the Nazis. All the surrounding islands around Vis were occupied by the Nazis. And the island of Vis was never occupied by the Nazis. There was a successful local and anti-fascist resistance, which succeeded to kick out the Italian fascists. And then, since the capitulation of Mussolini in September 1943, the island would remain free. And of course, at that time, there was a very hectic anti-fascist struggle taking place where the Nazis were trying actually to kill Tito. Tito was the leader of the anti-fascist struggle in Yugoslavia. And they attempted already an assassination plot in the mountains of Bosnia with parachutes, who tried to kill him, wounded him, but he succeeded to flee, ended up in Italy, and then after Italy, by boat, by a ship, came to the island of Vis, where you already had, as I said, very strong local resistance. You already also had some of the allies there, namely the Brits. And with Tito's arrival, the island actually becomes a headquarters of the anti-fascist struggle. He himself, for the first months, was hiding and operating at the same time in a cave on the top of the island. Our school is, in fact, some 10 or 15 minutes walking from this cave. Incidentally, it happened like that, but it's, as you can see, also grounded in this very long, very important legacy of anti-fascist struggle, which, of course, isn't just something which characterizes Europe, but it's of importance for the rest of the world. So why now, and what kind of school is it? Of course, it's a school which is influenced by various philosophies, various epistemologies, but also various resistance struggles. But at the same time, it's a school which is trying to look into the future and to draw its inspiration, not that much from the past, but from the future itself. For instance, I mentioned that, just to turn it a bit more into something more tangible and visible, I mentioned already that we were experimenting with a pirate radio station. I don't know if you watch these days, this movie with Julia Roberts and Ethan Hawke, Leave the World Behind, is pretty famous. Everyone is watching it. It's a kind of post-apocalyptic thriller with some Hitchcockian moments. But the main premise is that suddenly, I will not reveal why, because then I would spoil it, but suddenly all the communication means in the United States go down. So television, internet signal, mobile phones, and everything which is connected to the internet. So basically nothing functions anymore in the sense of communication. You can't really know what's happening. You can't really reach anyone else. You are becoming quite isolated again, although it was supposed to be the 21st century of hyper-acceleration and hyper-communication. And why I'm mentioning this movie, because it's a nice movie. At the same time, it shows something which is quite realistic, which is not a distant future. It already happens in war zones, in zones of protest, where, a government or a corporation can just shut down the internet and all communication means. And what we are trying to approach with the school, but not in a survivalist fashion, of course, is to deal with the question, what kind of means of communication, what kind of forms of life would we need in a situation of the post-apocalypse, if you want. And as said, it's not a survivalist fetishism or whatever, or undertaking, but it's just, I think, a question which is becoming more and more realistic. Many of us who are part of the school have been dealing with these questions through years and some through decades in various ways. We have people who have been dealing with various sorts of questions of this kind of creation of a life in the midst of a catastrophe, but also the reflection on good life. Many of us have been dealing with it either from the artistic point of view or philosophical point of view or very practical points of view. So the idea of the school is to, on the one hand, provide modestly a theory of the current catastrophe and a theory of change, which at the beginning might look like something very locally grounded, which it is. But the whole idea is that we are hoping that something which is at this stage locally grounded and will always stay locally grounded, it's very physical. It's the kind of work we do there is very physical. We are carrying tons of material uphill, building, reconstructing, distracting, constructing, all sorts of structing we are doing there uphill. And that's very important for us. So the idea is, on the one hand, to create a knowledge, an analysis of the current situation, but at the same time through not just theory, but through practice, to kind of try to materialize what we are theorizing about, to put it like that. And then hopefully this very local experience, very constrained experience in one way, hopefully it could be translated into other places, into other times, in the same way we are translating different experiences from different similar projects from across the world into a very local, specific Mediterranean context. And the idea is, which we are doing already, is to connect with various different projects like this all across the world, with, of course, partnerships with cultural institutions, universities. I mean, it's just the start. So we would really be happy to go even deeper and further in this kind of cooperations. But the idea is not just to build an isolated school, which sounds very romantic, on top of the hill of a beautiful island. The idea is to really create, a headquarters of critical thought and action in the midst of the Adriatic Sea, but at the same time, a school which is interconnected with various other projects, with various other radical theories, with various other experiments in forest gardens, solar energy, water collection, very material things which are crucial for facing the catastrophe, but also crucial for creating a sort of good life. And I mentioned it for the second time, I think, good life, because it's a very important concept, I think, which has to be reflected. And it's not something new. I mean, if you look at the history of philosophy throughout the last 2,000 and 3,000 years, I mean, it goes back to Ionian philosophy and Minor Asia, nowadays, which is Turkey or Anatolia. Those first pre-Socratic philosophers were also posing the question, what is good life? For instance, them came to the response that good life has to be connected not so much to the polis, but to the cosmopolis. So, that was the time, almost 3,000 years ago, of the origin of cosmopolitanism. And then, of course, throughout Socratic years, you would have different responses on the same question. It was a crucial question: in which way can we lead a good life? Is good life just pure hedonism, following the maximalization of your own happiness or profit, or is good life something else? Or is good life leading a life which is connected to some sort of principles or ideals or some sort of values which are universal and which are not just connected to the human species, but can be connected to other species, to the planet itself? So these are the kind of questions we are posing ourselves, and which we are trying to respond, not just in theory, but also in practice.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful that you had Bifo Berardi there. He's come to SFU through our program at the university, and we just had Michael Hart speak the other day, and of course he wrote for many years with Antonio Negri, who sadly passed away just a couple of days ago. Wondering, Srećko, in your broader involvement in the global left movement or building out a kind of progressive internationalism, have you been doing this work for a long time? Did you just come out of university on it? But wondering if you could speak just a little bit to your various involvements in trying to build out what could be called a international left or a global left, which has been, sadly withered for so many structural reasons over the years.
Yeah, all the names you mentioned, Bifo, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, I know all of them, and I was also very saddened to hear that Tony Negri passed away. Luckily, he had a difficult life. I think 1/3 of his life he was in prison, but at the same time he had a long and, I would say, happy life. He reached 90 years, and he was definitely and is definitely an important thinker of the radical left, whose book, together with Michael Hart, Empire, but then also Multitude, was really crucial after 1999 with the creation of the so-called ultra-globalization movement and so on. And that was the time, actually, after 1999, the beginning of the 2000s, when I actually started university, studying philosophy and linguistics at the Faculty of Philosophy in Zagreb. And at that time already, I was pretty young. I started to organize various stuff. I think parts of my inhibition came that I was unsatisfied with what was being offered in the official curriculum at the university. So, of course, we had a library where we could read Chomsky, Spivak, Roland Barthes, or Derrida, or whoever. We were also visited. In Yugoslav times, Jean-Paul Sartre had a major visit to Zagreb. There were many others as well visiting. But there was a lack in the 2000s of, I would say, radical theory. So, as usual in my life, I would reach out to people and start inviting them and start discussions and so on. And very early, we also started, I think it was 2008, something which was called the Subversive Festival in Zagreb, which was on the one hand a festival of radical theory and a festival of radical films. So, for instance, we would have a retrospective of Chris Marker, a retrospective of movies of Jean-Luc Godard. We were showing movies from China, from India, from Nigeria, which were all connected in a way or the other to social change, social movements, and this kind of topics. And then during those years, I had the luck to get in touch, not just with the mentioned Troika, Bifo, Hart, and Negri, but also with many others. So we had as guests in Zagreb giving keynote lectures, discussing with us, discussing also with the movements from the Balkans, various topics we had. It's a very long list from David Harvey, Slavoj Žižek, Zygmunt Bauman, Gayatri Spivak, many others. It actually helped, I would say, to bring a very lively and very important discussion into a post-socialist context. It's very specific. It's not the same as Canada or United States because we had more than 4 decades of real existing socialism. And with the bloody war through which Yugoslavia collapsed at the beginning of the 90s, after that, of course, we had the introduction of the free market. Everyone was dreaming about the end of history, similarly to Francis Fukuyama. This will now be the age of the final victory of liberal democracy and free choice, free speech, and free whatever. But it turned out, of course, as a period of so-called transition from communism to capitalism, in which we had structural adjustments, massive privatizations of previously state-owned or even socially owned infrastructure or public institutions and so on. And at that time, in a time of nationalism, in a time of turbo neoliberalization, there was a necessity for fresh air, for radical theories. And of course, we didn't just invite people from the world to teach us, but we were also at the same time teaching them that, there was an alternative in this part of the world, and that also various contemporary alternatives are also coming from this part of the world, which was very important for us who come from a region which by Maria Todorova was called the imagined Balkans, the Balkans as the dark heart of Europe, the darkness where everything can happen, from rape, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. And I think throughout years, through this festival, we really succeeded to build a critical mass, a critical scene in the post-Yugoslav space, which also had a significant influence on the European level. So in 2013, some of our guests were, for instance, Alexis Tsipras, who would later become the Prime Minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, the former Finance Minister of Greece, with whom I myself would found DiEM25 years later, the Democracy in Europe movement. So I would say, my kind of organizing practice goes back through the last 2 decades, something like that. Although I'm not that old. I sound like a grandpa, but what can I do?
Yeah. Well, you've been in the trenches of growing a movement, so sometimes the wisdom comes with that. It's beyond something of age. I wanted to speak a little bit to some of your writing projects and books. I actually had a book of yours, The Radicality of Love, sent to me by artists and cultural theorist Ania Milanowska from Poland, who's been one of the guests on our show. And she sent it to me. She's a big fan of your work and that particular one because of her own investigations into love. And you, of course, wrote After the Apocalypse and Poetry from the Future, What Does Europe Want? But wondering if you can speak a little bit to, I don't know how you get the time to write, but of course you're a philosopher and an organizer and a number of things, but wondering if you could just speak to a little bit of your writing work in the past and kind of what you're currently working on.
Yeah, currently I'm mainly focused on building the school, which takes a lot of time and unfortunately not much writing. But fortunately, a lot of physical action, which I really love. And at the same time, I'm a man of many hats. I'm also very active in a movement which is called the Progressive International, which is an attempt to build a new international. Many social movements involved, trade unions, intellectuals, and practitioners from all across the world. So there's not much time left to write, as much as I would love to, and as much as I had in my past. I also don't know how, but I think one recipe was that I always combined theory and praxis. So, for instance, you mentioned this book, Radicality of Love, which will soon be 10 years old. There is a chapter about the Iranian revolution and Iran today, and in which way totalitarian system from Khomeini's age with fundamentalism, in which way it has effects on the field of love, on the so-called libidinal economy. For that book, for instance, I was traveling through Iran, and that was also very inspiring, and also it gave me a lot in the sense of thinking material. And for many other books, Poetry from the Future, I traveled to protests in Hamburg against G20. I traveled to visit communes in Catalonia because I was interested in this kind of horizontal organizing, what maybe Hart and Negri would call multitude. But for all these books, in a way, I was also very, very much involved in something which is very material, in something which was also kind of field work, if you want. For the most recent one, after the apocalypse, I traveled, for instance, to Chernobyl, to be more precise, to the exclusion zone in Ukraine, and it was just 1 year before the war started. So I was actually lucky to have the chance to visit it, although, of course, I don't consider myself lucky to have seen what I have seen, because, as much as you read about it or watch the HBO series Chernobyl, which then influenced, of course, an influx of tourists just before the war to the exclusion zone, as much as you read it, I think you cannot really grasp it. But the problem is, of course, even when you visit it, you still can't. There is still something which is beyond comprehension, with something which Günther Anders, the German philosopher who for a while worked in the United States because he fled Hitler, what Günther Anders called the supraliminal, something which is beyond the limit, beyond the limits of understanding. And this kind of work, I think for me is, I got kind of used to it, that first of all, I'm not working in the academia. I, of course, give guest lectures, do seminars and stuff when good people invite me somewhere, but I'm not constrained in that sense by the classical academic work or the classic academic form, which gives me some sort of freedom that, I can travel to places where I want. I can also use different forms of writing, which are not academic, although they are always grounded in a very broad bibliography and sources. But my kind of natural inhibition is always to try to write in a way which is accessible, and to also talk in a way which is accessible to a broad audience, and not to get stuck in the silos or castles or ivory towers of academia.
Yeah, we interviewed someone, Svetlana Matvienko, a Ukrainian theorist who teaches here at SFU propaganda and cyber war, and she writes and has been visiting Chernobyl even since past the Russian invasion, and it's just remarkable seeing some of the thinking going around that project and the ongoing impacts of it, even right up until today. I was going to ask you about the current sort of socio-political context in Croatia. The various countries of the post-Yugoslavian context all have different nuances and context. And you, of course, have been involved in the underground and the left and the cultural context there, but wondering if you could speak a little bit to the present political context and what you see as some of the issues or excitements or syndromes of the present moment.
We need a series of podcasts for this because, as you know, I mean, you visited the region, but even if you haven't, it's a very complicated region. I mean, like what I meant talking about, every part of the world is rather complicated, I would say, because it contains layers of previous historical trajectories. It contains layers of previous historical tragedies or historical transformations, if you want. And of course, it's already intertwined with various contemporary crises which we are facing all across the world. So in that sense, the region of post-Yugoslavia or ex-Yugoslavia, or this part of the Balkans, of course, is on the one hand, it has a very specific, of course, I would say, history. Goes back to, I'm simplifying now, to big empires, which from the Greek Empire, Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Italian fascism, but then also Nazism, which tried to conquer this part of Europe, which tried to conquer it for various reasons, for natural resources, for human resources, cheap labor force, and various stuff. So I would say this region through centuries, but also millennials, was a region which experienced peace. Is not necessarily a short break between two wars, but the war is actually a kind of permanent state. And when I say that, of course, it's impossible not to think about the current wars which are still going on in the world, which also kind of amplify this thesis that, it's not peace, which is something which is a normal state, but it's actually war. And if you look at this region, of course, you would see many proofs of this. But at the same time, this region throughout all these centuries and millennials was also a region of resistance. It was a region of a very vibrant culture, very vibrant tradition, which in various forms still lives today. But the problem, of course, after the collapse of socialist Yugoslavia is that now you have several countries which were previously part of socialist Yugoslavia. Two of them are part of the European Union, which means also they're part of Schengen, which means there are no borders between them. But then Croatia, the country where I am from, now has the longest outer border of the European Union, which is directed towards Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Bosnia and Herzegovina were also part of the same country once. It's a country which is in a complete mess since the Dayton Agreement, 3 entities, which was before the war the most multicultural place in Europe, with Islam, Christianity, and Orthodox religion living door to door without big problems. But now it's a very complicated region. Then, of course, you have Serbia, an autocrat leader similar to Orban or some others, who is, of course, in good touch with Orban, on the other hand, with Putin. Where at the same time, also in Serbia, they just had elections. You have a growing left-green movement in Serbia. So in Croatia, that was already the case. They even won municipal elections. So the mayor of Zagreb, now the capital of Croatia, comes from a green left party. In Slovenia, the left, Levica, is part of the government. So I would say in the last 30 years, there was a lot of interesting developments. On the one hand, of course, it was the time of the shock doctrine, the structural adjustments, privatizations, this whole ideology of the end of history, liberal democracy, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you also had a lot of resistance, a lot of attempts to critically examine the situation, to provide different models of democratic governance, of economy, of a society, if you want, in the end. And so in the especially last 10, 15 years, some of these movements turned into political parties. Some of them came to certain instances of power. So the situation is quite interesting, I would say. Now, of course, the problems are various. I mean, from economic problems to political, social problems. Nationalism is still a big problem in this region, like not just in our region, but everywhere in the world. Right-wing populism or extremism. At the same time, due to the global situation and due to various wars which are happening, but also climate crisis, we are having the biggest numbers of migration in the last 2 years, both in Croatia and Serbia. In Serbia, it was mainly the Russians. In Croatia now, it's mainly Nepalese and people from Bangladesh and Pakistan, which is also a result of the fact that most of the citizens of these countries have already emigrated to other countries, mainly in the West, Germany, Austria, and so on, where they mainly work in construction, in care work, or hospitals, and so on. And now there is a lack of workforce. So you have all these interesting but also new developments in this region, which were not characteristic for this region, which was a rather monocultural region, I would say, to a certain degree. And now with the global changes, planetary changes, we also have these changes which are affecting society, economy, and so on. So I would say, it's a very interesting region, which is somewhere between the West and the East, between the European Union and, on the other hand, growing Euro-Asian integration.
Thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed, and I hope that next time we see each other, either on WIS or somewhere else in this region, and we continue our conversations.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Srećko Horvat. Head to the show notes to find out more about his work and ISSA. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.